Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight's shir is Le'ilu Nishmas, for the elevation of the soul of Pinchas ben Lipa Broida, and it's sponsored by his grandson, Rabbi Moshe Chaim Broida. The neshama should have an aliyah. The official question, it's a certain style when questions are posted, but not necessarily that's the topic for the whole lecture. So the topic which went around is whether that somebody, and it's a true question actually, it's a question which was asked, and as I will explain, by divine providence, after it was posted, I was asked by two other people the same question about the permissibility of vasectomy for men as a form of birth control. But I want to do something. I will, God willing, answer this question too. But I would like to do something which I spoke about from the very first lesson, and that is to go through, at least in a very, very general way, to go through the structure of the Torah. How is the Torah made? What makes Halacha tick? Because I think that without this lecture, or without at least a very general explanation, there'll be much less appreciation of all the questions that we discuss. Because ultimately, we're talking about any question in Jewish law, whether ancient questions or the most modern questions to do with modern science, genetics, medicine, fertility. A person can always ask a question: who says that this is the Jewish law? What made this rabbi argue the point in this particular way, and another rabbi to argue something else? Who decides who's right, who's wrong? What exactly is the system behind this great wisdom called the Torah? I would like to spend some time talking about it and giving you a few examples. First of all, it's not a coincidence that just a couple of weeks ago, the Jewish people celebrated 3,332 years since we became a people. And the world was given this present called the Torah, which is the divine wisdom, divine truth, the only divine wisdom, the only divine truth. Every other truth or wisdom comes from the Torah. Anything in this world which is true has to come from the Torah. There's no other truth in the world. And the Torah consists of all of the different laws and way of life for the Jewish world and for the non-Jewish world, for the rest of the humanity. Because humans were created in this world to be able to live their life in a certain way. And specifically for the rest of humanity, they were given laws called the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nei Noach, 7 Noahide laws. And the Jewish people received 613 commandments. The 13 principles, which are the foundation of the Torah, that everything has a building and a foundation. And the question is, what's more important, a palace or its foundation? The answer is both are equally important, because without a building, without a palace, nobody has anywhere to live. You don't have a house. But without the foundation, it's going to collapse. So the same thing with Judaism. There is this beautiful palace which combines within itself everything: the legal part, the mystical part, the ethical part, the historical part. It's all part of our Torah. But there are 13 foundations, 13 principles, which the Maimonides explain that without those principles, we don't have a common ground on what to talk about. In other words, everything rests on those principles. The first 5 talk about the nature of God, our understanding of God. God is one and one only. There's no Trinity. There's no idols. There's no anything else except for one unified godly essence, which combines everything with it. And we can only pray to God and serve only God. There's no intermediaries. The other 4 talk about the Torah. The fact that the whole Torah that we have, everything, is God's will. What does the Rambam mean to say the whole Torah? Everybody comes to shul, we open up the Ark, we take out the 5 books of Moses, the scroll, which is the holiest object we have. Everybody stands up, everybody kisses the Torah. Everybody feels intuitively that this is the holiest object that we have. The scroll is in fact what's called the Torah shebichsav, the written Torah. But the principle that we have is that simultaneously, at the same time, God has given Torah in two forms, in written form and the oral form. It's called the written Torah and the oral Torah. And we cannot understand one single mitzvah, literally, without the oral Torah. The written Torah is like a code. It combines in a very cryptic manner everything that we have, all the laws, all of the mystical concepts. Everything is hidden in the words of Torah. Sometimes you can have in one particular letter many laws that are included in that particular letter. And to be able to suggest that a nation can function and know how to live a life based on Jewish law just from the written Torah is ludicrous, because there's no way you can understand anything. There's some laws that we wouldn't even begin to understand. And I think it's one of the biggest miracles that we have today in the Jewish world. You know, if you look at the laws of tefillin is something, it's a holy object which contains small leather boxes with straps, and they contain the parchments from Torah. And today, archaeologists find ancient tefillin, which was found in Masada, in different parts of Israel, which tell us that Jewish people put on tefillin for thousands of years. And today also we have Jews from all types living in different countries, Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Bukhara Jews, Gruzini Jews, and all wear tefillin based on the same principles. Where in the Torah does it say that tefillin have to look the way they look to us today? Nowhere. There's some cryptic sentences, verses, that you should bind something on your arm and put something on your head, between your eyes, exactly how you put it, what does between your eyes mean, exactly what they contain. It doesn't say it all. And nevertheless, there's nobody among the Jewish people that has any other type of tefillin. We all wear the same tefillin, we all have the same calendar, we all have the same mikvah based on the same principles. And all of these things are written in a way that are not understood without some other explanation. And the answer is that from the very beginning of our existence, the Jewish people lived according to the oral Torah. The oral Torah was the guide which explained everything exactly how to keep. And the oral Torah was specifically not meant to be written down. It was meant to be given to human Kabbalah, which means receiving and giving over further and further. In other words, if something is written down and you rely just on the written, right away you would have people interpreting in a different way, and each one would understand it in a different way. But the oral Torah was given in such a way that it was given over in a very precise fashion, and the both the Talmud and the Rambam tells us exactly how it was given over. First, Moses had his Sanhedrin, which means the Supreme Court of 71 sages. That's the highest court that our people have. And the whole time when he received the Torah, was given over to the Jewish people. He taught his student Joshua, Yehoshua, who continued. And after Moshe passed away, it was the next court. It was passed over from generation to generation. Great people like King Solomon, King David, Samuel the prophet, all of the great prophets we read about in the Bible, they were also the transmitters of the oral teaching. Now, at the same time, while they were transmitting it, God also gave something very interesting instruction to the Sanhedrin. God gave not just the empowerment, but actually the responsibility to enact legislations. In other words, it wasn't just that the rabbis decided that apart from the biblical laws, which were inscribed in the written Torah and explained in the oral Torah, on top of that, God said, I want human input. I want the rabbinical input. I want certain laws to be added. I'm giving laws in its barest form, and there's a lot of danger that the way they are now, given by me, there may be mistakes. People may start to, it's like when you come too close to the cliff, you might fall off. So let's build fences. And he empowered and instructed the rabbis how to make legislations. That every generation there has to be rabbinical legislations made, and those legislations become obligatory on the Jewish nation. As long as they're made by the Sanhedrin, by the highest court, it becomes almost like a biblical law. In other words, God himself writes in the Bible that it's obligatory to listen to the rabbinic law, and the rabbinic law is not optional. So how was the biblical oral Torah given over? In two ways. There was a direct laws called Halacha L'Moshe Sinai. So God gave certain laws directly to Moses, and it said exactly how tefillin has to be made, exactly how you have to slaughter animals, exactly how you have to keep Shabbos. And then there were certain, many other laws were deduced by principles which were given over, special principle which interpret the Torah. So it's almost like if you have a code, you have a system which decodifies, which explains how the code works. And that's exactly the other part of the Talmud, the oral Torah, that all of the codes in the written Torah were decodified and explained. Now, in every single generation, from very beginning, there were rabbinical legislations. As a matter of fact, I have this very interesting book. It's 4 volumes. It's called Takonos B'Yisrael, Legislations in the Jewish nation. And it begins with Moses. From very beginning, Moses and his Sanhedrin, they made certain legislations. The fact that we read the Torah every Shabbos, it was made by Moshe Rabbeinu. Make it a bit this way. The rabbinical legislations, they were made in 3 forms. One form is separate mitzvahs. Separate mitzvahs means that you have 7 commandments, just like we have 613 commandments. You have also 7 commandments that are given by rabbis, such as Chanukah, Purim, washing the hands before bread, lighting Shabbos candles. Those are called mitzvahs derabanan, rabbinical commandments. On top of that, you also have different legislations made in different generations for the communities. And finally, you have many, many laws that were added to protect the biblical laws. They were called the Gezeirus and Takonos, decrees and legislations. And they were made in every generation, but specifically, the bulk of them were made by the beginning of rabbis called the Chazal, the sages. There was a certain time when the Jewish people came, they were led by Ezra. Ezra was a Jewish leader that came from Babylon, and they built a very large assembly called the Great Assembly of 120 sages. And they made a tremendous amount of legislations at that time. They felt, because the Jewish people were at the most vulnerable sort of time, they suffered from the exile in Babylon and everything else. So many of the legislations were made at that time by the rabbis. And at that time, there was also a very, very momentous time of a sort of a change, almost like a shifting, which overlapped between the generations of prophets and the sages. The remnants of prophets were still part of the Great Assembly, and already by the next generation it was gone, and they were called Chazal, which means the sages. So this was the transmission of the oral law. It was never written down. People had private notes, we know that, but they were never published. And a huge amount of law, together with all of the rabbinical legislations, were given over from generation to generation, until it came to a point where they realized that the historical challenges which the Jewish people were going through were necessitated to write down the oral law, which until now was all memorized. And this happened for the first time approximately 180 years after the beginning of the Common Era. And it was written in the first form of a very short book called a Mishnah, which was basically very short. You could see that at that stage, the bulk of the learning was still memorized, because the Mishnah was written in very concise, short paragraphs, and it was divided into 6 parts, and each part, dealt with different part of Jewish law. And by the way, there's nothing that the Jewish law doesn't deal with. Anything from the ritual to the holiday to the family law, as we studied until now, to laws of murder, to laws of respecting of parents, social laws, criminal laws, laws of contracts, business, ritual, impurity and purity. What makes something pure or impure? Which basically belongs mostly in the times of the temple, and today it's applicable on 3 levels, laws of impurity. One level is laws of nida, of laws of mikveh, that's also nothing to do with physical cleanliness, but to do with spiritual purity and impurity. Laws of a Kohen, being in contact with a dead body, because only a Kohen today is forbidden to be in contact with a dead body. And also when somebody, would go to the Temple Mount, also applies over there. So today, the bulk of the laws to do with purity and impurity are not relevant until Mashiach will come and a temple is rebuilt. So the Mishnah was written, and for the next 300 years, there were 2 schools in Babylon and in Israel that were discussing explaining the Mishnah. And finally, it was written in 2 Talmuds. The Mishnah is only one, and the explanations on the Mishnah, there's the Jerusalem Talmud, which was today printed in about 7 volumes, and also the Babylonian Talmud, which is 20 volumes of this nature. This is all comprises the oral tradition. When the Babylonian Talmud was completed, this was the end of the era. It was almost like the signature, the sealing of the oral law. Everything else which came afterwards is based on the Talmuds and other works of the Chazal, of the sages. And the very practical difference is that all of the legislations that came until the sealing of the Talmud, they obligated all the Jewish people, without exception. You don't find those legislation. I'm going to give a couple of examples, but you don't find any legislation whether it's Hanukkah or Purim or laws protecting, in other words, all the biblical laws, like laws of Shabbos, they also have the rabbinical component, the extra laws of kosher food. You don't find anybody today that says, look, I'm Ashkenazi, I'm a Sephardi, I come from Poland or from China, and therefore I don't keep those laws. Rabbinical laws which were established until the end of Talmud, they obligated all the Jewish people for simple reason that until the time there was one Sanhedrin, there was one Supreme Court that was central to the Jewish people. After that point, the community became so divided and dispersed that there wasn't one community left, and there were different courts and different authorities in different places. And there were still legislations which were made, but they couldn't anymore obligate all the Jewish people. So they're very good examples. So after the Talmud era has finished, there began a period of the Geonim. It went till about 11th century. From the 11th century started the golden era of the Rishonim, of the earlier commentators. They included giants like Rashi, Maimonides, and many, many others. And it was completed in the 15th century by the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch, I think he took it away. There was a book over here. The Shulchan Aruch is a great, great code of Jewish law written by Rabbi Yosef Karo. Oh, no, I got it here. Sorry. This is the Shulchan Aruch over here. It's one of many, many volumes. And the Shulchan Aruch is divided into 4 parts. Shulchan Aruch was written in 1500s by Rabbi Yosef Karo and has many commentaries which combine the Ashkenazi opinion, the Sephardi opinions that developed over the years. And it contains 4 sections of Jewish law. One of them talks about more of the daily rituals. One of them talks about things which are of nature of prohibitions like food or family purity, one or idol worship. One talks about family law, marriage, divorce, and everything in between, what we're discussing most of the time. And finally, business laws and monetary laws. It's all in Shulchan Aruch, contains all the factors of Jewish law. But for example, in the 11th century, there was a rabbi who lived in France. And this Rabbi Gershon, he realized there was a lot of problems with bigamy or polygamy. That you have a situation where having more than one wife causes certain problems in family structure. There were a number of reasons given what are the problems. And he made a cherem, which literally means more than just, it's like excommunication, a very strong legislation against marrying more than one wife. But again, he wasn't the Sanhedrin, he wasn't the Supreme Court of the world. So Ashkenazi Jews all followed his ruling. Sephardi Jews didn't. For a long time they continued we have Jews from Morocco, from Yemen, who continued to have more than one wife. In the approximately 13th century, 14th century, there was a legislation for Ashkenazi Jews, which also was disputed, but at the end it sort of won, on Pesach, that on top of the actual chometz, on top of not being able to eat leaven, which means the types of grains that are forbidden on Pesach, they also forbade things which look like, also they sort of rise, like rice or certain types of legumes. They're called kitnias. And Ashkenazi Jews accepted the custom. So today you will find that Ashkenazi Jews wouldn't eat rice or legumes, but Sephardi Jews still do. So you see that all the legislation that came afterwards already depended on the community. So you have these things that today govern the Jewish law. You have the biblical law, which also comes from the written and oral Torah. And you have the rabbinic laws and customs, which became also embedded in the Jewish life. And I want to tell you something interesting. That the rabbinic laws and the customs, they're also part of the DNA of the Jewish people, so to speak. And they make us what we are. And God takes them very seriously. There's one very interesting mystical observation on how God looks at all the three components. On the biblical law that he gave, that he spelled out, on the rabbinic law that the rabbis legislated through his encouragement and empowerment, and the customs which developed on their own. And this mystical teaching says like that you compare, let's say you have a boss, a person who runs a company, has a confidant, a person who works for him, and this person, not one, but let's say you have 3 people who work for him. And those people are trying to please the master, and they're trying to serve the master in the best possible way. One of them will do everything that the master tells him to the T. He tells him to do something, he will do it. He will never fail it. The other one, not only he will do what the master says, but he also will get hints. The master will tell him certain things as a hint, and he will understand the hint. The first one won't, but the second one will understand the hint and he'll do it. And the third one, not only he will understand the hints, and not only he will actually keep the direct instructions, but he will also intuitively feel what the master wants, and he will do it without even a hint. So this mystical teaching tells us that the first level of keeping something because you're told directly, that's the level of the biblical law. The second level of a hint, that's rabbinical law, rabbinical legislations. And the third one, which the Jewish people developed over the years, and it became part and parcel of our life, is the customs which became completely included in the Jewish life and practiced by all the Jewish people. And as a matter of fact, when somebody, for example, converts to Judaism, and we spoke about the concept of Kabbalah and mitzvahs, accepting the mitzvahs. If somebody would say, I'm only accepting the biblical commandments and not the rabbinical ones, that wouldn't be a acceptance. It wouldn't be considered the person accepted it, and the conversion wouldn't be kosher. Conversion includes biblical commandments, rabbinical legislations, as well as the customs which became part and parcel of Jewish life. So this is the makeup of our law. After the Talmud, there was codes, the code of Jewish law, the Shulchan Aruch. After Shulchan Aruch, till today, they are rabbinic authorities continue to produce works on Jewish law because the Jewish law is never ending. The new questions come up, new precedents, new inventions in science that demand our attention. And using the ancient principles, the rabbis continue, and the modern works are based on either on new codes or what's called the tshuvas, the responsa literature. There's a very large part of my library is when rabbis of all different generations have answered questions which were asked in their times about subjects which may not have been touched before, but they have to answer it based on ancient principles. So this is the structure of Jewish law that we have today. Now I want to be able to answer a question which was asked a number of months ago, and to use what I spoke about now as an example, because we know the rabbinical legislations is, on one hand, they seem to be sometimes less severe. For example, on Shabbos, when a person is sick and a person has to be able to do something to help himself. First you break the rabbinical law, and then you break the biblical law. Or for example, certain blessings. If a person is not sure whether he said a certain prayer that is of biblical nature, if he's not sure, he has to be strict and he has to repeat it. And if it's rabbinical, then we are told if you're not sure, you don't repeat it. And as a result of it, you could develop a notion rabbinical laws are less important. But the answer is that's not the case. The rabbis were empowered by God to make legislations, but they were complete masters of those legislations. And they set the parameters. They said exactly when legislation follows all the way and when it's limited by certain limitation or certain types of conditions. I'm going to give 3 examples. One of them was asked a number of months ago, and it created quite a discussion among some members of the community. The 3 examples I'll give, one from the laws of family law, to do with Maaser case, which we spoke about, one to do with laws of kosher food, and one with Shabbos, with Sabbath observance. So when it comes to, let's start with an example of kosher food. So the Bible tells us, the Torah tells us, that that you're not allowed to cook the kid in its mother's milk. Again, it's a cryptic statement that can only be understood through the oral tradition, which was given at exactly the same time. So the oral tradition says we're not talking about just a kid and its mother's milk. We're talking about any kosher animal, whether it's a domestic animal or an animal which is not domestic like a deer. Any kosher animal, you cannot do 3 things to do with meat and milk. You can't cook it in its mother's milk, you can't eat it, and you can't have any benefit from it. Benefit means you can't even cook it and give it to a cat or a dog or sell it. So it's different to a normal laws of kosher food. If somebody, for example, has a non-kosher bottle of wine, you can give it as a present, you can give it to a non-Jewish person who's allowed to drink it, you're allowed to sell it. But when it comes to meat and milk, once it's cooked together, you can not only can't eat it, you can't have any benefit from it. The rabbis have included also the chicken. Why? They said, and there was many reasons why, because the rabbis were given the intuition to know when the law will become misunderstood or sometimes not kept properly. And they saw that the chicken on one hand is very similar to meat because it also requires ritual slaughter. It's not like fish. And therefore they said that if you will allow to eat chicken with milk, the general population will also think that maybe meat and milk is also limited. Maybe you can, the only prohibition is actually like it says in the verse, that you can't cook the kid in its mother's milk. Now it's important to understand that even though the rabbis have given reasons for the legislations, legislations are without unconditional. It's not conditional to it. You can't say, well, I think I won't make a mistake, therefore I can do it. It becomes a law, all-encompassing. But at the same time, while the rabbis made this legislation about chicken, they said, but it's not on the same level. You can have benefit from it. You can give it, for example, to a dog or a cat. If chicken was cooked with milk, it's not on the same level as meat. You still can't eat it together. You still have to wait a certain amount of time between having chicken and milk as with meat and milk, but you can still give it to you can have benefit from it, financial benefit or benefit by giving it to an animal. Why is it different? What's the logic behind it? Either make it all the same or make it different. But the rabbis were, like I said before, they were masters over their legislations. They didn't make them absolute. They always said it's up to here, but not beyond that. When it came to the laws of Maaser, we spoke about Maaser is an illegitimate child that is born from a either incestuous or adulterous relationship. So there is a biblical Maaser, and a biblical Maaser is a Maaser without any doubt. You know for sure, for example, this particular lady she was married and she was with a particular man in prison. There was nobody else could be there. So you know for sure they didn't come from a husband, and you know for sure it came from this Jewish man. So this child is called a Maaser Vadai, a Maaser who is for sure Maaser. That has a biblical weight. The Bible says explained in the oral Torah that only a vada mamzer, only a mamzer who's a certain mamzer, cannot marry into the general community. He has a stigma of mamzer, but a sofek mamzer, a doubtful mamzer could. But the rabbis included a sofek mamzer also into it. Again, it was all divinely inspired. It was encouraged by Hashem to on every single mitzvah to add the rabbinical components. Now, there is another level of a rabbinical mamzer. And this will come into an interesting point. A woman is married, a husband goes away to fight a war, and he doesn't come back. You don't know what happened to him. Over here, the rabbis actually made an interesting leniency, that while in every aspect of Torah you need two witnesses, over here they said one witness is enough to be able to testify that the husband is dead, to allow the lady to remarry. But at the same time, they knew that this will create a situation where a lot of women and a lot of even rabbis will be very eager to be able to help them to remarry. But at the end of the day, they could be causing a lot of problems, because a husband could come back and it wouldn't be a favor for her. It could cause a lot of problems with the mamzer and everything else. So when it came to a situation, it's very ironic that when a woman cheats on her husband and she you don't know who's a partner, and she has a child who's not from her husband, you could say, listen, since most people around us are non-Jews, and as I mentioned last time, if the father of the child is a non-Jew, then the child is not a mamzer. You're only a mamzer if the father is a Jew, who is not the husband. So if a woman is of immoral nature, she goes and she sleeps with every second person, so on and so forth, then there's easier to find a solution for the child and to say that it's not a mamzer. But in a situation where she was a very pious lady, and she got married to another man thinking that her husband is dead, and the child and her husband shows up, then first of all, there's no question that the child is a mamzer. There's no room to be lenient, because you know that she wasn't having affairs. She married another Jewish man. And at the same time, the Talmud says, Teitze mizeh u'mizeh, v'avlad mamzer, she has to divorce both husbands. And the reason why this legislation was made was in order to make sure that when they give permission to marry, that her husband is really dead. That you don't try to sort of to very superficially to search for it. Now, this particular so if she divorces the first husband, but she doesn't divorce the second husband, biblically you don't have to divorce. Why? Because if you remember in the very I think it was second lecture in the beginning, we spoke about the fact that the regular biblical prohibitions, like a Kohen marrying a divorcee, then even though it's a forbidden marriage, but the marriage took place, they need a divorce if they want to get divorced. When a brother marries a sister, there's no need for divorce. When you have arayos, when you have these forbidden relationships of the highest possible severity, there's no need for divorce. And as a result, you would ask, why do you have to divorce the second husband? That's the rabbinical legislation, to divorce the second husband. And if she doesn't divorce him, the child remains what's called a rabbinical mamzer, a mamzer on the rabbinical level. But the same rabbis who made this particular rule, they also said that if you have a non-kosher divorce is a very intricate part of Jewish law, and only very great experts are allowed to officiate at a divorce. Because if you don't have a divorce, all these consequences, a woman is still married and so on and so forth. So there are two types of non-kosher gittin, non-kosher divorces. One of them is called posel. It's rabbinically, there's something rabbinically wrong with it, and something which is biblically wrong with it. If something which is biblically wrong with it, then it's not kosher at all. It's as if she's still married. If it's rabbinically not kosher, on one hand, she still has to get another get, and she cannot remarry with that particular get. But if she has a child, the child is not a mamzer. Why not? Why should the child be a rabbinical mamzer? Because the rabbis excluded it. And those are the examples. The third example is, it was written in one of the on the, I don't know, Facebook, Instagram, I can't remember exactly what, but the little short laws of Shabbos. What you can do on Shabbos and what you can't do on Shabbos. So it was written, again, it's very difficult. It was specifically written as a very short law without explanations, and it caused a lot of questions and a lot of excitement, and I'm going to try to answer it. On Shabbos, one of the things that you can't do is you cannot squeeze a fruit, for example. Squeeze the juice out. It's called schita. Schita means squeezing. And what was written on that particular communication, if you will, it says that you can squeeze a lemon onto a solid, for example, on a schnitzel or on a solid piece of food, but you cannot squeeze it either in an empty cup or into a cup of tea, into liquid. Why? It was explained because when you're squeezing, you're not allowed to separate liquid from solids, and when you squeeze it onto solids, it's considered like you're not separating. It's the fact that in between it's liquid, it started with solid, it very quickly ended up in solids, and therefore that's not prohibited. And it caused a lot of questions, and I promised to answer it, so I will answer it, and if you bear with me for 5 minutes. When it comes to Shabbos, like every other part of Jewish law, if we would read the Bible, the 5 books of Moses, we would have no clue what Shabbos is all about. It says to not do work on a Shabbos day. What does work mean? For me to pick up a heavy chair and to move it from one end of the room to the other end of the room, that could be a harder work than sometimes to close lights on and off, or to be able to strike a match. So obviously work doesn't mean what's difficult for us. There's a definition of work. And the way that Talmud defines, the oral Torah defines work on Shabbos, is a creative type of work that was used in order to be able to either to build the temple, the temporary Mishkan, sanctuary in a desert, and for the purposes of operating this particular sanctuary. So the types of works are directly connected. And the Talmud lists 39 types of general types of activities that are forbidden. Each of these 39 works is called Av Melacha. It's a general work, general type of activity. And each one, it's all biblical, it's not rabbinical, and each one has certain tulas. Tulas means certain types of activities that are derived, like branches. Literally, Av means a father, and a tula means a child. So there's 39 fathers, and each main type of 39 works has a offshoot. And the specific work activity connected to what we're saying now, many of them were agricultural activities because they had to create certain types of herbs, and to do it they had to plow and sow. So all of these activities to do with gardening, with pruning, with sowing, with cooking, with cutting, it's mainly creative type of work, building, destroying. Those are the 39 types of work. One of them was called dosh. Dosh means threshing. Threshing basically means removing inedible attachments from produce. And one of the main tools which are practical to us, these offshoots of this work, is called mefarek. Mefarek means extracting manually food or liquid from its attachment or covering. And specifically, it means squeezing juice from its fruit. That's considered to be mefarek, and it's a biblical prohibition. However, not all fruit are the same. Biblically, you're only forbidden to squeeze from olives and grapes. Why from olives and grapes? Because in Judaism, again, I'm saying it very quickly because I want us to cover vasectomy. I promised to cover vasectomy, but I'm going to say it very quick, that the definition of a mashka, of a liquid, in Judaism specifically applies to many different laws. But in other words, the many areas where something which is defined as a liquid has a certain consequence, a certain type of a law. And the 7 types of mashkim, liquids, are wine, honey, olive oil, milk, dew, blood, and water. Those are the 7 types of liquids. So only, as far as fruit is concerned, only grapes and olives are forbidden biblically. At the same time, the rabbis through rabbinical legislations, they've included other fruits also. Again, they included it as God empowered them to do. He said, you know what, in order to create a fence around the biblical laws, take all the things that will look the same and include them also. However, like in all the other examples I've given you, examples of a Maaser, example of chicken and milk, they've also made certain exclusions. They said in certain things it's the same, but we're going to make it less. And they knew the psychology of people, mentality of people. They knew exactly how much to give, the minimal amount, or rather the maximum amount that you give them, and then you don't do more than that. So to give you a few exclusions. Exclusion number one, if you put a lot of grapes into a bowl on Shabbos or on Friday, and throughout Shabbos it keeps on oozing grape juice, you're not allowed to drink that juice that came out oozing from the grapes. But you would be allowed, if you put a lot of strawberries or cherries, you'll be able to do it, because the rabbis excluded it. Said if here oozing, we're not going to include. That's only when it comes to grapes and olives, because if you will drink the juice which came out from grapes and olives, you will also start squeezing them. But with other fruits, it's already a double thing. It's already like a double protection. We don't need a double protection. That's already enough with other fruits. And the second example was, the rabbi said, you know what? The actual squeezing also will only prohibit it only if you squeeze it either on liquids, from liquid to liquid, or into an empty space on its own. But if you're going to do it on solids, we're going to make it, we're going to limit our legislation. So basically, to make it very short, it's the rabbis who legislated something. They are the masters of exactly how much they're limiting it. So I hope this, at least a very short, will answer the question. It's not something which has to be logical to the fullest extent. It depends on the legislations which the rabbis have made, and always limited them. In every single example, you see how they didn't go all the way with them, as they would go with some other of its legislations and enactments which they've created. So now, when we discuss anything over here, genetics, fertility, I hope that it'll be a greater appreciation that it's not something which comes in a vacuum. It's not something that some rabbi decided on its own. A lot of work went into it, based on the ancient principles which were existing already for many, many years. And Torah does allow for arguments, and it does create a forum how to resolve those arguments. So at a certain point in our history, arguments began, and they are a very large part of the Talmudic study are disagreements, but at the same time, a system is given how to be able to resolve the arguments and to come to the actual final solution and the final law. We're coming to the question of vasectomy. And that's something which is a general question of birth control, which I was asked actually by some people to expand on it, and I don't think there'll be time today, because we have a few questions that I promised to answer which came through. But vasectomy is one particular form of birth control that is completely forbidden, and I'll explain to you why. Judaism doesn't prohibit every form of birth control, but even among the ones which are forbidden, the one which has the greatest amount of consequence is vasectomy. Now, what is vasectomy? Vasectomy basically is a cutting of what's called the vas, the spermal canals of a man, which will not allow for them to be able to bring up the sperm, and thus it'll be sterilized. It's like a permanent sterilization. And the reason why it's forbidden completely, and I'll tell you why, with very frightening consequences, because in the book of Deuteronomy, in the same portion which talks about a Maaser, and it says that a Maaser cannot enter the mainstream community of the Jewish people. He can't marry into the mainstream community. It brings a few other examples of people that cannot marry into the mainstream community. Some of them apply to certain nations that don't exist anymore. They used to be, up to a certain point, until about 500 years before the Common Era, there was Jewish people, and there was 70 nations. And the Assyrian emperor while he exiled the 10 tribes from the Jewish people, he also mixed up all the other nations. And many laws that apply to our relationship with those nations don't exist anymore because those nations are mixed up. There were specifically nations that we are told that even after they convert, they retain the same status as a mamzer. One nation was Egyptians, but only for 3 generations. So an Egyptian convert, when he would convert for the first and the second generation, he'd be considered a mamzer. In other words, he couldn't marry into the mainstream Jewish community, and only the 3rd generation could. Another example was Moabites and Ammonites. They were told they can never marry into mainstream, but only men, women are allowed to. This was the story of Ruth, the great-grandmother of King David. There was a whole polemic about her because the oral Torah wasn't written yet, and she married a Jewish leader called Boaz, and she was a convert who came from Moabites. So that's also, there was a whole question whether King David is legitimate. It's a very interesting story which deserves a different discussion. But those things don't apply today. We don't know how Moabites are, we don't know how Ammonites, even Egyptians are not considered to be the Egyptians of once upon a time. But there are 2 types of men that are still till today considered a mamzer, like a mamzer. They cannot marry into the mainstream community. And one of them, and they're all connected with certain mutilation of reproductive organs, of sexual organs of a man. One of them is called ptsua daka. Ptsua daka is a technical term when somebody has mutilated or crushed testicles. And when a man has his testicle crushed, he cannot no longer marry into the mainstream. And the other example which is applicable to vasectomy is krus shavcha. Krus shavcha literally means that the flow was cut off. It either means the actual organ was cut off or the spermal canals. So technically, if a man would go through vasectomy, not only he couldn't marry into the mainstream like a mamzer, but he would even have to divorce his wife if he's already married to his wife. Now, when it comes to divorcing the wife, obviously we are very, very, we try our hardest not to break up a family if somebody didn't do without knowing about it. I received a call, I think it must have been a year or 2 ago, I can't remember. There was a gentleman from Queensland, and he says to me, look, he was never religious, he's married a Jewish lady, he did a vasectomy, and now he became religious, he wants to know what are the consequences. So I found out there was a doctor, there's a couple of doctors that I know in America who do a very successful vasectomy reversal. One of them is called Dr. Sherman Silber, a genius of a man. He's a fertility doctor. I deal with him a lot. He's one of the pioneers in many areas of fertility. He lives in St. Louis, and he does quite successful. There's a lot of, when it comes to vasectomy reversal, there's a lot of success if you do it within the first 10 years. And this way you could save the marriage. There's also within vasectomy that there's a certain method that also it would not be allowed, God forbid. But once somebody did it, there could be room to see whether you can rule leniently for him not to have to divorce his wife, to remain married to his wife. Now, again, I want to be able to make a very important point, that all the questions that I'm asked in this forum, doesn't matter what they are, could be on any section of Jewish law. They're not meant to replace, if the question is asked on a personal way, in other words, it actually makes a difference to a practical question of Jewish law. Don't rely on what I'm saying over here, because I'm oversimplifying it, and there could be a lot. If we would rely on what I'm saying over here, I've given you examples in the previous lectures, how if people would rely on general answers, a lot of times they wouldn't be able to find solutions, because general answers are exactly what they are. But every time you must deal with a specific problem, and therefore all the questions I'm asked over here, if they actually are related to practical situation, don't rely on what you hear over here. Those are general answers, whatever time allows. There has to be a specific and individual approach to every question. That's a very important foundation in Jewish law in answering questions, not to rely on general. Over here we're gaining knowledge to see what are the issues, but every question has to be dealt with separately. When it comes to vasectomy, we would never allow it in the first place, But once it's done, would already give advice either reversal or to examine exactly how it was done and to see if there's any way to save a family. I must tell you that I was asked a number of times, and I actually wrote on that subject. Young men, religious men. I remember 2 cases in America happened just recently. And those 2 cases I'm including in the book, which I'm hoping to publish. They both had a very similar situation. They developed cancer in the testicle, and the testicle was removed. In both cases, I ruled that they're kosher to remain married and there's no problem with them whatsoever. And there was a number of reasons, but the Talmud explains the 2 types of these mutilations that we're talking about. Both ptsodaka, with testicles, and krushavka, with the cessation of flow, which is the organ or the spermal canals. There are 2 types of ways that they inflicted on a person. One is called bidei Adam, by the hand of man, and one is called bidei Shemayim, by the hand of heaven. And there's a discussion within the medieval commentators, what does by the hand of heaven mean? And the Rambam Maimonides, he says anything that was even included if somebody was very ill and his life was in danger, and therefore the sickness was inflicted by heaven, even if afterwards it was cut by men, it doesn't actually make a person disqualified. It's considered that this particular defect was inflicted by heaven and not by human beings. And the vast majority of the later authorities, they agree with the Rambam and not with the Rabbeinu Osher, who argues with the Rambam in his definition of what it means to be inflicted by heaven, so to speak. But anything which is done on purpose, now when a person inflicts on himself, that's something, of course, which is no question that it's called bidei Adam, by the hand of man, which would make a person disqualified. Again, these questions were dealt very, very seriously on individual basis. I wrote quite a number of pages to argue the point, but again, like every other question when it comes to the continuity of Jewish people, it was supported by other poskim, and those men asked me I should give them in writing a certificate just for spiritual reasons. They shouldn't have the comfort to know that the life, married life, will be without any questions of Jewish law. And Baruch Hashem, one of them already, his wife became pregnant, because in both cases they still were able to have children because only one testicle was taken out. Now somebody asked a similar question, if I can ask Aaron, to do with prostatic.
Okay.
Somebody sent in a question. By the way, the question of vasectomy was asked this week by 2 other people, and in both cases I told them that under no circumstances they can do a vasectomy. But as far as other forms of birth control, we'll discuss at a different time.
Okay, so just before we start the questions, I wanted to mention again that you can send in your questions to info@rabbiulman.com. You can email the questions and we will try to get to the questions as soon as we can. We do have a bit of a backlog of questions, but we will bli neder answer all the questions. So, and the questions that you're sending in right now on the chat, I'm getting many questions. Thank you very much for them. And if we don't have a chance to get to all of them today, I am saving the chat, so I will save your questions and write them down for future lectures. So the first question we have is, what is the differences in halacha between vasectomies and prostatectomy?
Okay.
Maybe you can also explain what.
Right.
That
So
is, yeah.
the second one is a removal of the prostate, which is only men have a prostate removal of prostate. It's interesting that sometime in the 60s or the 70s, the Lubavitcher Rebbe wrote about that in those days they would sometimes when they would remove the prostate, they would damage the spermal canals, and the Rebbe wrote a medical suggestion how to be able to 2 ways how to do the operation. Is actually printed in a very important publication called Oitzar Poskim, which is a very multi-volume halachic encyclopedic work. And the Rebbe said at the time that since one of the ways of the prostatic operation could damage the spermal canals, it's better to use the other technique. There's no question that in a situation when somebody would have, for example, a prostatic cancer, And to save a person, it will fall into the category of bidei shemayim, with the hands of heaven, and that you'll be able to do it. But thank God today, all the doctors are using a different technique, and the way they operate on a prostate doesn't in any way interfere with the spermal canals. So today it wouldn't be a problem. It was a problem back in the 60s and 70s, and then you would have to instruct. I still get asked by members of the community to speak to doctors just in case, before they will go through a prostatic operation, just to make sure that it's done in that way. But I see more and more that the way doctors do it today doesn't interfere with it.
Okay, now we have a few questions on brisim that came in.
I think it was from last week, and we didn't answer all of them. Maybe we'll answer a couple of them, yes.
We'll answer a couple of those. So the first one is, can a bris be used as a definite sign of Jewishness if someone has a bris?
It depends where and when. In certain, there was certain time when in certain cultures it became very popular to circumcise even with non-Jewish people. So, for example, until recently, a lot of Anglo-Saxons routinely circumcised the kids. Even in the royal family, they actually used the Jewish mohel. It was always a chosen mohel from a community that was used to circumcise the royal family. They stopped doing it. Today, I would say that you cannot use it, even though the fashion for circumcision comes and goes among in a non-Jewish society. It's still not. It's still used enough not to be used as a sign of Jewishness. Maybe in a certain country where nobody circumcises that you could, but otherwise not.
Okay, next question. Is there a scenario where a baby or a Jew does not have to have a bris?
With the exception of 3 cardinal laws, which basically is idolatry, arayos, which is that level of sexual immorality we spoke about, and murder, where one has to give up one's life. When it comes to other mitzvahs, the Torah says, "V'chai b'hem," you should live by them. So if for some reason there's certain danger to the baby's life, you push off the bris, and you don't do it, even though it's such an important commandment that is one of the foundations of our covenant with God. And it's interesting that the Jewish law is actually stricter than the doctors when it comes to deciding whether you push off circumcision, or, for example, the level of bilirubin and the jaundice in a child. A lot of times I would say, when I'm asked the question to push off the bris, when doctors say it's fine, because we have very specific laws exactly how healthy the child has to be in order to be able to perform the circumcision. So if the rabbi said it's okay, I can assure you every doctor would say it's okay. It never happens that doctors are stricter than us. But certainly in a situation when there is a threat to life, you have to push it off.
Okay, and final question about the bris. Can someone go into a shul or get an aliyah or get married under a chuppah or get buried in a Jewish cemetery without a bris?
Right. As much as the bris is such a fundamental part of our connection to God, and it's something that even supersedes Shabbos. On the 8th day, if the child becomes 8 days and he's healthy, you circumcise him on Shabbos and on Yom Kippur, even though technically you're performing because the Torah says that the law of circumcision supersedes laws of Shabbos and Yom Kippur, and nevertheless the person's still Jewish. And therefore, the only thing is that if a person, God forbid, dies without a bris, then he is circumcised before the burial. But otherwise, we encourage him to have a bris, but he's still Jewish without it.
Okay, next question. This one comes in on a completely different topic. This one's on the topic of Maaser. Maybe we can also explain what Maaser is, just briefly. But someone is asking like this: can you please explain the difference between giving Maaser from your net payment versus gross payment, and which is the right approach?
There are laws in Judaism to do with tithing certain things, giving 10% of one's produce and animals and so on and so forth. And this extends to giving 10% of one's salary. It's called Maaser Ksofim. In other words, we are obligated to give charity, and we have to give as a minimal 10%. As a minimal. And this 10% comes from the net, not from the gross. In other words, when a person pays taxes, you pay from the net what comes to you. If you get afterwards tax return, then you also pay Maaser 10% on that tax return. Whatever money that you get, you have to pay taxes on. You have to pay Maaser. It's like a religious tax, which you give to charity. And Maaser cannot be given on things that you're obligated to do. So, for example, if a person is obligated to give money to the poor on Purim, you cannot use that money of Maaser because this is extra money that you're not obligated to do. So, for example, you cannot buy necessities like a lulav and esrog that you're obligated to use on sukkahs, that 4 species of plants that you make a blessing on, that can't come from Maaser because that's something that you're obligated. Maaser is separate from your regular obligation. Now, when it comes to paying for the one pays rent and one pays mortgage, so on one hand you cannot say that it's deducted. Otherwise, you're going to say, look, I'm going to basically use everything that I need in my life, and then by the time you finish, you say, look, I have no money left. If I'm not going to pay any Maaser, so you have to be able to pay Maaser on your net salary before all your necessities. However, the Jewish law doesn't say that a person has to go broke or go into debt. So in a situation when a person owes money to somebody else, he has to pay it back first. He cannot use Maaser, cannot say, look, I have to give charity and therefore I'm going to be in debt. The money that you owe somebody, even though Maaser in the way it's a debt to God, but God says, I want you to pay the money you owe people first, number one. Number two, sometimes I had questions asked of me that people really went through very hard financial times, and I said, are we obligated to Maaser? And the suggestion I gave them was, and this suggestion is also a spiritual suggestion. On one hand, we want them to cope with life, right? If they go, sometimes when they give Maaser, they wouldn't have money to pay the bills. So what I suggest them is to keep a logbook, and they can write down what they owe the Maaser. It doesn't matter how long it takes. In every single situation that I advise this to people, God paid them back and they were able to give much, much more they had. In other words, the actual idea of not rejecting Maaser, not ignoring it, but even keeping the book itself was also a blessing that the Torah says, Aser, the Torah connects the word tithe with the word wealth and says that if you give 10%, you'll become wealthy. And even writing it down and not ignoring it, giving them the ability not only to pay the Maaser later, but also to be able to to get on the feet. That's a very spiritual concept.
All right, so we have another question, but I think you answered, but I'm going to ask it just in case anyways. Someone is asking, is one allowed to use Maaser money for personal use, for example, school tuition, or to help for purchasing a home?
The school tuition, I would either want to answer directly to the person or next time, because it's a bit more complicated, because school tuition has many components. And certain parts could be used if a person can afford it with a Maaser, but not everything. And it's something that if whoever is in that situation can contact me and I can explain more details of how to do it. I was asked a question which I will, God willing, answer sometime in the future. It came to me directly, anonymously. That a woman writes to me that she was married with a chuppah kedushin, and she had an affair, and she read that once you have an affair, you have to divorce your husband. She wants to know what to do in this case. She wants to do the right thing. So that's something which I will, Emir Hashem, answer another time. If you can write it down and remind me. Came down. I want to thank everybody for writing questions. And we have some interesting topics coming up. God willing, in the next week I will post some of the interesting questions that we're going to talk about. And I want to wish everybody a very, very good night, and see you next week. And I thank you for the sponsor, and Aliyas and the Shoma for his grandfather, for Pinchas ben Lipa Broide. All the very best.